the evening service. The T-I-O-N word, the shun word that we're looking at today is contribution. Contribution. Last week we talked about participation, and usually when I talk about tithing and money, I have a sermon I've preached several different times, at least once or twice here, and it divides that responsibility into three areas. When we think of tithing, we think of giving God what is duly His, and there's a whole lot about that we could say, but we'll say it as we go through the study. And so A, B, and C are the three things that fit. You might even remember these if you do. Number one is time. I believe that God wants your time. You say, well, I'm a very busy person. Good. So am I. But you can always find time to help other people if you will but look for it. So your time, whatever you're good at, whatever you know how to do, whatever you can use to help other people or to serve the church or whatever the case might be, then it doesn't require all of your time. Even being a pastor doesn't require all of my time, and yet your time is important, and make sure that you're giving God part of it. Secondly is your talent. Letter B is your talent, things that you know how to do. Time is usually a factor in part of them, but whatever you can do and whatever you have, then learn to share it. I'm going to use myself as an illustration here, just because I don't want to embarrass you today. I tried to give wood to Mr. Kaiser 2 different times, and I can get it somewhere else, I can get it somewhere else. I know what he was doing. He doesn't want to take my wood, but I had wood coming out my ears. Not literally, but I did have a lot of wood that I was not anticipating. So I had wood that I could share, and it's not going to hurt me for several years. So I finally just said, I'm bringing wood over, and we did. And then they fed us and so on and so forth. We enjoyed the time, enjoyed the visit. But if you say, well, maybe I don't want to give my wood up. I'm not just talking about wood, and I'm not just preaching at Russ. I'm saying that you have abilities and talents that God can use in many different ways. Again, maybe to help with the church, maybe to help break the ice in dealing with somebody about talking to them about the Lord. The concept that you can walk up to somebody cold turkey anymore and give them the plan of salvation and they get saved, I'm not sure it ever worked really good, but they like to usually see that. If they will see in your life what a Christian is really supposed to be, then they will be more interested and more willing to be listened and talked to. So use your talent and use it appropriately. Number 3, or letter C, is your treasure. Your treasure. Now you say, well, I don't really have a treasure as such. By most of the world standards, we do. The things that we own, even as the poorest of people in this part of the country, we have a lot. But when we're talking about treasure, we think of it as a hidden chest full of jewels and diamonds. No, we have money. We have a wealth. We have a worth. And we need to learn to be good stewards of it. I happen to have been contacted recently by somebody who's a friend of mine, and he's really about my age, but he has quite a bit more money, and he's concerned about having somebody who would take care of that if something would happen to his wife or himself or both of them. And so we've been talking and working out some arrangements. That's a good thing, because if you have earned the money that you have and have it set back for in one fashion or another, maybe for your retirement, maybe just a savings account, although we don't put that in anymore. What happens to that if you get killed or you die? Well, the state has a plan for it if you don't, so you need to be a good steward of that. But we're going to talk about this from the point of view of the money that you operate from on a regular basis. Every one of you probably either because of income you have because of retirements or Social Security, or you're still working at a job and not wealthy and unemployed like Byron. Are you still working for the railroad? Not right now. Are you happy? Cold out there, man. I saw your guys go by the other day and I thought, ugh. So anyway, whatever your financial state is between you and God, this is what we're talking about. What you live on every day, every month, how you plan, so on and so forth. No, I'm not going to tell you how to do that. I'm going to show you some examples of what we find in the Word of God. Number one, we're going to first look at tithing in the early Old Testament. Early Old Testament. Back before what we would consider the law, and a time in reality that we don't know a lot. Once in a while we'll get the indication in a New Testament passage that God had told Noah something, or how did Cain and Abel know to bring a sacrifice that was a blood sacrifice? Doesn't tell us in the Bible how they knew that. So there's a lot of things that God did with these people, and this is one of those times. The early Old Testament, we aren't told a lot of things. But now I just told you we're going to go to the early Old Testament, but we're going to go to the New Testament to look at it. Hebrews 7, verses 1 through 4. And then you're going to be right here for your next verse, so stick your finger in there. Hebrews chapter 7. Paul here is writing, I believe, to the Hebrews, the nation of Israel, and he is using Old Testament application to help them understand what Jesus Christ was, who he really was, and what he did for them. But in respect to the early Old Testament period, in chapter 7, Hebrews, verses 1 through 4, for this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him, to whom also Abraham giveth a tenth part of all, first being by interpretation king of righteousness, after that also king of Salem, which is king of peace, without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth a priest continually. Now consider how great this man was, even whom even the patriarch Abraham gave the tenth of his spoils. The tenth is considered the tithe. 1/10 is considered the tithe that was given. And you could go to the Old Testament and read this. It doesn't say anything that wasn't said here. Who was Melchizedek? Good question. There are many people believe, I happen to be one of them, that this was really a pre-incarnate or a pre-coming to this earth as a babe in the manger, Jesus Christ. And if you look at the verse found in verse 3, that he was without father, without mother, without descent, no beginning, no end, that would make who you would think of. Okay, that's immaterial. We're not going to center here upon who this Melchizedek is. We're going to center upon he was a religious leader provided by God, and Abraham realized that even before it was ever made the right thing to do according to the Old Testament law, he gave him a tithe of everything that he had. And that's not just money. We think of it in money terms today because that's the way we operate. You don't get a whole bunch. You don't get a little bit of money for your week that you put in and a few groceries and a little gasoline can they fill up for you so you can drive. And no, you just get a money. You get check or whatever, and that's what you do with it is your business. In the early Old Testament, long before it was the law, Abraham was giving to Melchizedek 1/10 of his. Why? Because that's what God told him to do. I believe it's a principle that's laid down that carries on through the Old Testament and New Testament. Number 2 is the Old Testament law. First the early Old Testament, then the Old Testament law. That's in chapter 7, verses 5 through 9 of Hebrews again. And verily they that are of the sons of Levi, who receive the office of the priesthood, have a commandment to take tithes of the people, according to the law, that is, of their brethren, though they come out of the loins of Abraham. But he whose descent is not counted from them received tithes of Abraham, and blessed him that had the promises. And without all contradiction, the less is blessed of the better. And here men that die receiveth tithes, but there he receiveth them, of whom it is written that he liveth. And as I may say so, Levi also, who receiveth tithes, paid tithes in Abraham. So, number 1, it connects the tithing to Melchizedek with the tithing to the Old Testament priest. And so I believe it starts a sequence there of being following on. And realize that in the Old Testament, and the nation of Israel was a large, large group of people, up into the millions at times, that the tribe of Levi, which was the priestly tribe, all the leaders of the religious sect of the Jews, was from the tribe of Levi. They did not have jobs as such. They did not have land as such that they could go make a living. So they lived off of what the people gave as a tithe. They gave it to the priest. The priest lived off of it, but they were really giving it to God, so God was providing for the priest. And that was what came in, and foods and everything else, and all these sacrifices and stuff. That's what the priest lived on. And God ordained that in the Old Testament law. He explained it out in great detail, and that is what they were supposed to be doing. Okay, let's shift to number 3. And I'm not trying to rush this, but I'm going to slow down way toward the end. Number 3 is early New Testament church. Early New Testament church. Acts 2, 41 through 47. This is the earliest church that we have because it's the first one mentioned after the day of Pentecost when the church was officially started. And it happened in Jerusalem. It was a very miraculous thing, the coming of the Holy Spirit, and speaking in tongues and cloven tongues of fire and great mighty rushing winds. Somewhere they were in Wyoming, I'm sure, if that was true. But in Acts chapter 2, verses 41 through 47, we'll find out what the first earliest of churches did. Verse 41, then they that gladly received his word were baptized, and the same day there were added unto them about 3,000 souls. And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, and fellowship, and in breaking of bread, and in prayers. And fear came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were done by the apostles. And all that believed were together and had all things common, and sold their possessions and goods, and parted them to all men as every man had need. And they continuing daily with one accord in the temple, and breaking bread from house to house, did eat their meat with gladness and singleness of heart, praising God, and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to the church daily such as should be saved. Now I've realized that there's people who say, oh, look at that. This is the early church practicing communism. No, that's not true. That's not true at all, because communism has a hierarchy of people who suck the good out of the less, and so it's not really communism. But what were these people thinking? Well, Christ had just ascended not too long before that and said that I will come again, and I honestly believe that their thought was that he was coming right back. And so they thought, we don't need all these things. Let's sell the snowmobiles. Let's sell the motorbikes. Let's sell the boat. Let's just give it to the poor, to the people in our church that need it, and we'll be okay until Christ comes back again. Now, I can't prove that, but you can see it happening. They were that excited about being Christians. And yet, we find that did not last long. It did not last long at all. In fact, very short period of time before things started to change right off the bat. The concept was that the church at that time was basically in Jerusalem and was thousands of people, but it didn't stay there very long. They soon started to be spreading all over, and the church started to be smaller groups of people. That takes us into number 4, which is the developing New Testament church. The developing New Testament church. This goes over a time period with no real beginning or end. The beginning would approximately be when the early church started to not disband, but to disperse. That's why when Paul came along on the scene, not too many years after that he went to a church in Antioch and was a teacher, preacher there until God called him to be the first missionary as such. And so the church had started to change a little bit, and we'll look at what they are doing. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 9 through 14. Now this is a fast overview. I'm not trying to make light of it. I just got something else I want to say besides this. This is kind of like your lesson, your history lesson for the day. 1 Corinthians 9, verses 9 through 14. 1 Corinthians 9, 9 through 14. For it is written in the law of Moses, thou shalt not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treadeth out the corn. Does God take care for oxen? Or saith he it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written, that he that ploweth should plow in hope, and he that hath threshed in hope should be partaker of his hope. If we have sown unto you spiritual things, it is a great thing if we shall reap your carnal things. If others be partakers of this power over you, are not we rather? Nevertheless, we have not used this power, but suffer all things lest we should hinder the gospel of Christ. Do ye not know that they which minister after holy things live of the things of the temple, and they which wait at the altar are partakers with the altar? Even so hath the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel. Now, in the day that we are at, this has been expanded, but you see the shift change. These people were all of a sudden realizing, oh, this isn't a sprint race. This is an endurance race. We are in this for the long haul, and they didn't even have any idea what was going to be happening. The church between this time of the early developing New Testament church and the church that we have today is thousands of years later, and through many, many multiple changes. Some things are different, some things stay the same. Basically, from what the Word of God says, we try to pattern everything we do over on how the Bible says that the principles laid down to the early church would still be carried on today. One more, 1 Corinthians 16, 1 through 3. 1 Corinthians 16, 1 through 3. In all honesty, there's very little said in the Word of God about giving. You know why? Because it's assumed. That doesn't always work the best, but that is the reality of it. That's like assuming. I had a young man that had graduated from homeschool that went to work for me one summer when I was a pastor in South Dakota, and he wanted to work for me in the worst way, just did. His parents were having a terrible time having to get done with his schoolwork. I told him that I needed him in 1 month. If he was done with his school, I would hire him. He started getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning and doing his own schoolwork with nobody asking. He wanted to work for me. He did change his mind later. But anyway, the first time he showed up at my job and I said, go over and measure that board and see how long it is. He looked at me like, what? So I took my tape off. I said, go measure that board and see how long it is. So he hooks it on. He goes down there and I can see him looking at that thing and looking at it and pointing at it and looking at me and looking at the board. And I said, you don't know how to read a tape, do you? No, sir, I don't. I wasn't too impressed. So I sent him some homework that night, made him learn how to read a tape. But the whole point is that we can sometimes get in trouble assuming things. I assumed he knew how to do a lot of things that I found out that he didn't know any of them. But the whole point is that, well, go to 1 Corinthians chapter 16. It says in verse 1, now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye. Upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store, as God hath prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come. And when I come, whomsoever ye shall approve by your letters, them will I send to bring your liberality unto Jerusalem. What all this involves is going to come up in a minute, so I'm going to just leave it lay here. But I do believe the principle laid down that we keep accounts and know what we have been given so that we can give the right proportion. Now, everybody's going to do that different. Everywhere I go in Thermop and do business all the time, and I live off my debit card, not my credit card, but my debit card. I use that because I don't have to carry money. I have charge accounts at certain stores and so on. Everywhere I go, they always say, oh, yeah, you're the one with the wife who's an accountant. Here's your receipt. And I have them in my wallet right now. If you want to see a bunch of them that I haven't given her, that's just how we operate. She keeps my checkbook to the day. And sometimes she'll say, what did you buy at the so-and-so store today? Why? Because she had looked up the electronic balance and wanted to know where I spent my money. Now, I know where it's going, but for the sake of her doing my books, she has to know. And she has to know everything. We'll talk about this verse in just a minute. Let's go to number 5. The present day New Testament church. The present day New Testament church. Now we're done with your Bibles. Okay? Everything I want to talk about for the rest of this sermon is practical application, how things are, and how this operates. If somebody's on the internet watching this service, you're going to get a history lesson today about an independent Baptist church. A lot of people have questions about that. I answer that question probably more than anything else. You're the pastor of an independent Baptist church. What does that mean? Well, it means my people are extremely stubborn. No, that's not what that means. It means, and that's what we're going to tell you. So the rest of everything we talk about is reality of where we are today, which will make application to what we're going to do at the end of the service. Letter A. Most churches today have salaried pastors. Now, some smaller churches, like this one, pay a pastor, me, and to consider it more or less part-time. While I have no problem with what I make doing here, I also realized that I couldn't live on that in this day and age. And I understood that when I came here. I didn't come here to be the pastor. Now, the people here know that. I came here to fill in the pulpit because the former pastor had left. And so I did, and I was here about 5 weeks when they said, we'd kind of like to have you just stick around. Well, I said, my wife goes with the deal, so they had to think about that for a while. But then they finally decided, no, we want you to be our pastor. We went through some other hoops and so on and so forth, but they pay me. Now, I try very hard not to be a hireling, like say, well, let's see, they want me to go here. I don't think they pay me enough. I don't think I'll go do that. I can honestly say that never, ever crosses my mind. If I have to go put gas in on my car and go do something, I go do it. That's the way I feel about it. But most churches today, most larger churches especially, have a pastor who's on a salary. He's paid a certain amount every month for the work that he's to do. That takes money. So if you're going to say, well, I don't believe in tithing, and then go show up at a church all the time and not be a part of it, you're kind of cheating, aren't you? Now, I'm not. I realize there's a whole lot of possibilities to that question, and I don't mean it disrespectfully. You can actually go to a church and give to it and not have to be a member of it. That's not a requirement. We take an offering, and we don't take it up here anymore. We have a box back there, and that is not where your gum wrappers go or anything else. That's where we put our checks or money or whatever envelopes that you want to put in there. But it takes money to run a church. And so salaried pastors are the very first thing. Now, I've had people who have come to me knowing that I'm a pastor. In fact, in Spearfish this happened. Our neighbor was part of a group who left another Protestant church and started an independent church. Not a Baptist church, but an independent church. He walked over one day and he says, I got a question. He says, we have some money. He says, we're trying to decide, should we get a pastor first or a building first? I said, you're asking my opinion? He said, yes. I said, get a pastor first. He says, why? Well, he was a builder. He was a school teacher too, but he was a builder. He said, we need a building. I said, I understand that. But I said, you can find buildings. But I said, you need a leader. And I said, unless you have somebody that is in the group who is going to be your leader, and you're going to recognize him as such, but you can't just work by mob rule through this whole thing. And I think you're far more important that you have a pastor. And I'm not saying that because I'm a pastor, but I've been around the block enough times to know that you need somebody who's in charge of things and who doesn't necessarily make all the rules, regulations, and make all the decisions, but still keeps the whole project going one direction. A church is much like a general contractor. A general contractor probably doesn't pour the concrete. He probably doesn't put the studs in the wall. He doesn't put the roof on. He makes sure that there's somebody there to do all of that for you. And so the pastor doesn't necessarily have to do it all, but he is to see that it gets done. Now, pastors vary drastically. I happen to be a building pastor, and I love to build, and I use it for some of my other income, and I use it here at this church. I have it every church I've ever been a part of. When I was a pastor in South Dakota for 20 years, I went to 9 different states helping churches with their churches because I had the ability to do that and the permission of my church to go and do it. I just didn't ever miss on Sunday. And so that person is going to vary, but in this day and age, it takes money to operate a church, and the pastor being the first one of those. The question also comes up, and somebody who's watching this might be from a denomination that says, well, how long do you stay there? Once again, being an independent Baptist church, we don't have anybody who tells us, well, it's time for Pastor Fanning to move on, and this person's going to come be your pastor. That could happen, but it's going to happen through this local church, not through a denomination over the top of us. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. So we have today pastors that are on a salary. That requires money. Where does that money come from? Well, I don't believe in bake sales and all that other stuff. I believe the scriptures teach that it comes from the money that people give as their tithes and their offerings. Letter B, we have a treasure. We had a long discussion about who would be our treasurer, and after all the qualified people returned it down, Heath took it. Now, Heath feels that way some days, I'm sure. That's not true. In fact, we realized that when we had let Heath become our treasurer, which we asked him to, and he consented to, and I'm very glad for that he put it all on the computer. So now, if you want to be the treasurer of this church, guess what? Good luck. That doesn't change anything. Having a treasurer speaks of enough financial decisions or job that goes along with it that is more than the pastor would maybe be able to handle, but also it spreads out the accountability. Now, I have preachers that disagree with this next statement. I don't believe a preacher should ever have anything to do with the money in a church. I don't in this one. I can't sign checks. I don't go ask Keith and say, well, how much are the Andersons giving? He wouldn't tell me. He better not tell me. I don't want to know. Don't care. Has nothing to do with it. I know pastors who can sign checks out of the church. I don't think that's right. We have a treasurer who signs our checks, and we have an assistant treasurer now who, because he works for the real treasurer, not as just a treasurer, but then the same job, then he gets to get off a lot of his responsibilities to his assistant, so he doesn't have to work so hard. That's how it works, right? But no, it's called accountability. Whenever you have money involved, you need to have accountability, whether it's a little bit or a lot. Because if it is a lot and you don't have accountability, it will soon be a little bit. Somebody will see to get their dirty hands on it. And that's even true within churches. So, accountability. But it speaks of that there's enough money that it requires somebody to take care of it. And while you think, well, we're not really that big, Christ had 12 disciples. What was Judas's job? He was the treasurer. He was a crooked too. So you have to live with all of that. It's a responsibility to carry the responsibility of the money in a church. Letter C. This is where we're going to get to today. Missions. Missions. What Paul is talking about, I really honestly believe this. Some people disagree with me. I think the principle of tithing can be used in 1 Corinthians 16. But what they were really talking about here was that Paul would go around, and all of the missions that they had were always going back to Jerusalem. Now, the reason for that was, you say, well, man, there was a church of 3,000 people there. There's a word in there that just answered your question. There was a church there of 3,000. But it pretty much got disbanded and dispersed. And it spread out all over the place as God wanted it to. Otherwise, we'd all be going to Jerusalem to worship today. But these people spread out. Some did not leave. And I believe that was of God. Some of them stayed in the area. But you have to realize that if you are a born-again Christian in Jerusalem in the day and age of 1 Corinthians 16, you had a hard time finding a job, a place to live, or anything, because you were a social outcast. So the church went from a church of 3,000 with all kinds of money to we don't know exactly how big, but they were poverty-ridden. They didn't have anything. And so Paul would go around, and these churches would make commitments that they were going to help out, and as he would travel, they would give him offerings, and they would put on there that they would, this came from so-and-so, so that when the church at Corinth got, or at Jerusalem got it, Paul would say, okay, this love offering came from the church at Philippi, what we know as the church at Philippians with the book written to them, or Ephesus, or whatever it might be. And so missions were done a little bit different than they are today. But that's what this point was, that he says on the first day of the week that you should lay aside in store as God has prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come. So you have to this done ahead of time, have it taken care of, so Paul could pick it up and take it to Jerusalem. But then carry along with that the thought about, well, if the missions is run that way, then shouldn't the church be run that way too? We're sticking to missions. Missions today, in most Baptist churches, especially independent Baptist churches, is done one of two ways. I don't know that one you can say is any more scriptural than the other. One has probably a little bit more to do with people that are bookkeepers. And lots of times the person who is a bookkeeper will be the one that you will have as your treasurer because they know what to do with it. Now, there's a ton of headaches to being married to a bookkeeper, believe you me. But a bookkeeping mentality, and this is many churches, every church I'd ever been in until I came to this one, did it this way. Of all the money that came into the church on the general fund, 10% of it was set aside as missions. And then that 10%, whatever it was what was dispersed to the missionaries. So in that system, a church, and I still know churches that work without a budget, and I just shake my head, because we have a budget in this church. If you were at our last business meeting, we adopted the same budget we had last year. You know why? Because other than the building, which was money that was given from different local individuals, some here, some out of state, that gave toward our heating expense and so on and so forth, our budget we just about nailed last year. What we said we were going to spend in every area, we nailed it really, really close. So how are you going to improve on perfection, right? But it was close enough that we just said, okay, we don't see any reason looking ahead. We know we've got some people that are older it's going to be more difficult for them, or the money's not going to be available, and so we don't see any reason to change anything, but we have a plan. On a 10% budget, we would take that figure, and since we're on the internet, I'm going to tell you how much that figure is, but let's say that it was $100,000. Heath wishes it was, but let's say that it was $100,000. Then 10% of that, $10,000, would go to missions and nothing else. Then, in archive churches, we would find missionaries going to fields. They would come through, report to us. We do have those people already, so we don't have to go do that. Not that we can't add or subtract as we have to. We had a missionary at our last meeting that we dropped because she has been retired for some time, is now living with her daughter, and said, I just don't want it anymore. So we dropped her. We are going to be going through our faith promise thing here in just a few minutes, and so see what we can work with. But the 10% of the general budget is a very common way to provide your missions for your local church. Who you support is up to the local church. Nobody says, well, here's a missionary you have to support, or here's a list of 50 missionaries, and you give your money to us, and it will go to some of them. We don't operate that way. I never have. But instead of giving 10% of the general budget, we also have something we call faith promise. Faith promise can be operated several different ways, but I'm going to give you, for the people who might be watching this, what happens in our church. And I was not a part of this. It happened before I came here. I haven't tried to change it, wouldn't. And I don't know that there's a set rule in our church about how often we do this, but we do try to keep with the touch of the people. So our church passes out, and it's going to happen this morning, to either people who want to be a part of this or to all of our members. It's not something that we go out and demand. This little slip of paper does not have a room for your name on it. We don't want to know who you are, but realize that we take this very seriously. Because if you write down on this piece of paper, which says, Faith Promise Missions, after prayerful consideration, I or we, depending upon whether it's an individual or a family, promise to give sacrificially above and beyond our tithe to the church, to the Faith Promise Missions, the monthly amount of blank as God provides. So the 10% that is your tithe goes to this church. The above that, which there's no limit to that, you are sacrificially giving, in other words, beyond what is expected of you. And that's how we run our missions. So when we get all of these back, we add up the amounts and we come up with a dollar figure that we have that we can give every month. And that's what our treasurer does, is every month he writes checks to our missionaries or to their boards, and they receive that check. And those checks are all accumulated, deposited, and then given to the missionary on the field, wherever it might be. We will have to look at our situation this year. Right now, I don't know anything. But if we were to say, just to throw out a figure, let's say that we had a $2,000 mission budget right now, and all of these come back, and we have $1,500. We have a decision to make. I'm not even going to say what that decision is going to be because I don't know. We haven't faced it yet. I don't worry about things that haven't happened yet. So we'll address that. But that's how we do it. And so this happened not too long after we were here, and we actually had a speaker come in. Trying to get a speaker to come this time of year with this COVID stuff is like pulling teeth. And so we couldn't find anybody to do this, so I decided I'd do it. We're going to pass these out at the end of the meeting. We're going to let you have 2 weeks, next Sunday and the Sunday after, and then we'd like to have them back, and so that we can, as a church, have our meeting about what we're going to do with our missions, whether we have to let it grow, if we have to cut it back. We can only work with this amount of money. Okay? So tithing is what you give to your local church that God designed. Love offerings are considered above and beyond that, and there is no limit to them, and it's something that you might just feel a burden to do. I'm going to share something personal with you. We have a missionary friend of our own. We keep his letters back here for our people to see. I read them sometimes. Our church does not support him. I wish that we did, but I can't get him here. He's in Australia, and he just doesn't get home very much. He's sent out by a local church, and he is in a church in a very active way, and in a fairly good-sized church even, but every part of the country is different than that. Part of the world is different than that. My wife and I picked up support to him when my mother passed away because she was supporting him, and when she passed away, I didn't want to see it stop. So we committed together that we would continue to support him. We send our money for that above our tithing and above our faith promise commitment to a mission board in another state that sends that money to him. That's your right. It's your privilege. You can do anything you want. God expects his tithe. And then if you say, I'm going to be a part of this faith promise, you need to realize that's a vow before God. It's not to be taken lightly. Say, well, I need my pickup payment is due. I guess I can't give my faith promise. Tell God about your problems. Don't come to me. You need to take this very, very seriously. But it is also by faith. You don't know you're going to have a paycheck next month. Say, oh, yes, I do. No, you don't. You can't tell what's going to happen. After this last year, if you haven't figured that out, you need to pay closer attention because everything could turn upside down in a heartbeat. Well, you say, well, what do you do then? We'll worry about it when the time comes. So, if you have any questions about that after the service, don't hesitate to ask. Let's turn this off, Heath. We're going to go ahead and pass these out. If you've been here and listening to all this, you have any questions, our phone number is on the website, and you're more than welcome to call me, and I would try to answer it.